Welcome to our webinar, You Have to Start a Thing, Women's Suffrage in North Carolina. I'm Diana Wynn, President of the League of Women Voters of Wake County, and I'm going to address some preliminary information and then introduce you to our presenter. Before we begin, I want to clarify a couple things about how we're using Zoom today. Except for the presenters, everyone is muted and you're not on video. We're not using the chat feature today in Zoom. Instead, type your questions in the Q&A feature. If you hover your computer mouse near the center bottom of your Zoom screen, a menu will appear. You should then be able to click on the Q&A option. Some questions we may answer in writing, and other questions will be answered live at the end of all the presentations. At the end of the presentation, LWV Wake Vice President Sheila Den will serve as our moderator and will ask our presenter some of the questions that you submit in the Q&A box. I'd now like to introduce you to our presenter. Raylana Poteet is a native North Carolinian who has worked at the NC Museum of History for just over 2 decades. She has a bachelor's degree from the College of William & Mary and a master's degree from Wake Forest. Raylana has served as the curator of political and social history for the NC Museum of History and recently became the museum's chief curator. She has curated exhibits on subjects ranging from North Carolina's governors and Watergate to historic clothing and historic photographs. She also worked on the museum's large chronological history of the state, the story of North Carolina. Her most recent exhibit is You Have to Start a Thing, and she's excited, I know, to talk to you about the struggle for women's suffrage in North Carolina. And I'll now turn it over to Raylana Poteet.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can make my head disappear so that y'all can see the slides, and we'll go ahead and get started. I just wanted to give a little bit of an intro about this exhibit. We did the exhibit for the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and we opened March 6th, which means that this exhibit was open for about 10 days before we closed down for coronavirus. So some of my pictures are from when the exhibit was going up, and then some I took more recently, but right now we have all the artifacts wrapped to protect them from light damage while no one's in the museum. So I think you'll still be able to get a pretty good idea of what the exhibit looks like. For anybody who's wondering about the title, You Have to Start a Thing, we took that from a quote from Lillian Exum Clement, who was the first female legislator in North Carolina. She was actually won her primary in the spring before women got the right to vote in 1920. And she was interviewed by the News and Observer in 1921 and said that she wanted to blaze a trail for other women. I know that years from now, there will be many other women in politics, but you have to start a thing. And the team working on this exhibit found that to be a very powerful quote and something that we wanted to use as the title. Here's just a glimpse of the exhibit. It's actually not a large exhibit as far as space goes, but it is in our lobby so that everybody who comes in can see it easily. It's sort of a U shape going in, and it's divided into 3 basic areas. In the first one, we talk about the national movement and set the stage for what was going on nationally. In the middle section, we focus on North Carolina and how that fight for suffrage was different here. And then in the final section, we talk about how that struggle continues, because of course in 1920 it was really only white women in North Carolina that got the right to vote. Women of color still had to continue that struggle, and it wasn't until 1965 and the Voting Rights Act until they really received the right to vote. That section also addresses the birth of the League of Women Voters. It talks about the struggle for the ERA in North Carolina. We talk about how women are still politically active and engaging in protests today. And then we also cover some of the female politicians in our state. So before we dive fully into the exhibit, there were a few things I wanted to start with. We have these labels throughout, and I know y'all probably can't read these on the screen. I just wanted to have them to remind me to hit these points. These are our shout out or call out labels where we make points that we want to make sure the visitor is getting as they go through the exhibit. So one of them we have is about the language What does suffrage mean? I know everybody here knows that means the right to vote. I'm sure a lot of things I'm talking about today y'all will know already, but women's suffrage versus women's suffrage comes down to when you're talking. We tend to say women's suffrage a lot today, but in the period in the late 1800s, early 1900s, most women who were working for suffrage did use the term woman's suffrage. And then suffragist or suffragette, again, this comes down to, you hear them interchangeably today, but at the time, especially North Carolina suffragists would have been using the term suffragist. Suffragette was sort of a pejorative term at the time that was used to describe the very militant suffragist workers in England. And because in North Carolina we were a conservative state and the fight for suffrage was conservative here, most North Carolina suffragists would not have appreciated being called a suffragette. We have another one, what's up with all this yellow, where we talk about the colors. You'll notice in our labels, we're using a lot of purple and yellow, but North Carolina, getting back to that conservative idea, was heavily associated with the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA, and their colors were yellow or yellow and white. The National Woman's Party, which did not have as much support here, and we'll delve into those two groups a little bit later, their colors were purple, white, and gold or yellow. So that's where a lot of the purple comes from. And then sometimes you will see purple, white, and green, but that tends to be heavily associated with suffrage in England. And then we also have, why are some of the pictures in here so grainy? We did use images of women in this exhibit that are not up to what we would normally consider our visual standards, because they were the only pictures I could find. A lot of the women that we highlight, the only place I could find an image for them was in a reprint of a newspaper or scanned out of a yearbook. And then, so we use this label to point out to visitors that until very recently, a lot of archives and museums did not think that it was necessary to preserve images of women. This is an interactive that we have sort of at the beginning of the exhibit. And since this program was originally going to be a tour of the exhibit, I'm sort of trying to go through in order as you would as you were walking through the exhibit. And we have this at the very beginning, particularly for people who may not understand why it was a struggle to get the vote. We talk about how voting rights changed in North Carolina over time, how initially it's only white men who own property, and as it moves through to African-American men, and then eventually to white women, and not until 1965 until all women really have the right to vote. Excuse me. And so in this interactive, there's a little wheel you can spin, and it moves you from year to year, and you're able to see, if I were a white man, could I vote? If I were a woman of color, could I vote? And it just sort of helps set that scene for people going in. So the exhibit is divided, as I said, into 3 sections. So the first one is that national movement. We do have some quotes scattered throughout the exhibit. You know, men their rights and nothing more, women their rights and nothing less. This is from the Revolution, which was the paper that was run by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So we talk about the early years of the women's movement in this section. And those early years, so starting around the middle of the 1800s, the movement is primarily going to be white, well-educated women who live in the North. There is very little suffrage agitation going on in the South, very little discussion of suffrage at all in the South that you can find. But these women, some of them came together in 1848 at Seneca Falls, which you'll see as sort of the beginning date for fighting for women's suffrage. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton met in 1851 and spent decades working together for suffrage. Lucy Stone, also one of the early campaigners, one of the first women to keep her maiden name when she married. Sojourner Truth, who was one of the early African-American suffragists and who attended lots of different gatherings and gave speeches. I think it's important to remember that when these women are working for suffrage, what they're doing is they're holding annual meetings, they're writing newspaper articles, they're circulating petitions, they're doing consciousness raising, but they're not actually getting that far with most of the American public. It's still not an overly popular idea in these early years. Racism divides the movement. The movement has a big split after the Civil War, and racism is a big part of that. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony break off and form their own association, the National Woman Suffrage Association. They refused to support the 15th Amendment, which would give formerly enslaved African American men the right to vote without it giving women the right to vote too. They frankly use some very racist and white supremacist language when they are talking about this. They really did not believe that Black men should have the vote before educated white women. And so they break off in one direction. Lucy Stone and some of the other leaders break off in another direction. And so they're not really accomplishing all that much in the ensuing years. It is important to remember that, of course, there were African American suffragists. Most of these, as I mentioned earlier, are going to be in the North or West. So we address Ida B. Wells Barnett, who formed the Alpha Suffrage League in Chicago. She marched in the big parade that we'll talk about in a little bit. Nannie Helen Burroughs, who was the head of one of the, or the largest association for African American women. It was a Baptist association. She also actively fought for suffrage. Mary Church Terrell marched in parades. She actually picketed the White House with the National Woman's Party, which we'll get to in a little bit as well. So even though there was a strong tinge of racism in the movement, there were African Americans who were taking part. Now, when national groups had their annual meetings in southern cities, these women weren't necessarily welcome. There was still that ongoing element of racism in the movement. But by 1890, the split heals and the two groups come back together to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which I'm going to call NAWSA most of the time. And so as the fight enters a new century around 1900, so the group comes back together, you have NAWSA. They are fighting sort of state by state for a while for the right to vote. They're not getting that far, honestly. There are a few Western states that have given women the right to vote, but they're not making a lot of movement or change in the Eastern states. And you have some new leaders come in around 1910 or so, and they want to sort of take the fight in a new direction. They start pushing to fight for a national amendment instead of the state by state approach. And you have women like Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who we'll meet again in a minute, who come up with this idea for a grand parade or a pageant in Washington, D.C. to sort of relaunch the movement. And so they have this giant parade, which they intentionally planned for the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. So it's going to be on March 3rd, 1913. They want to take advantage of all the crowds that are in town. They very purposely use this imagery of sort of beauty and strength. You can see Inez Mulholland, who is up on the upper right, who is there perched upon her white stallion in her flowing robes, and you can see it in the program as well. They were trying to do away with the sort of the image of the crusty old spinster as the supporter of suffrage. You have educated women who are walking in groups with their colleges. You have professional women who are marching. The bottom left shows a nursing group that's marching together. And so they're trying to come up with this new image for the movement. Now that ongoing issue with racism is happening in this parade as well. In the bottom right, you have a picture of Ida B. Wells Barnett, who came to march in the parade shortly before the parade was going to start. Alice Paul got nervous about African Americans marching with white women in DC, which was still a very segregated city. And she asked them all to march at the back of the parade. Some women did that, but Ida B. Wells actually just sort of stood off to the side and waited until the Illinois group came by and then stepped out and marched with her delegation as she had planned to do. Now, as I said, they did this parade because they wanted to take advantage of the crowds for the inauguration, but things did quickly get out of hand. You can see on the left, their float where they're demanding an amendment to the Constitution, and you can kind of see the parade backing down through the crowd. The crowds were very large and the police did nothing to control the crowds, so it did not take long to sort of evolve into chaos. You had men, especially in the crowd, who were spitting on the women, shoving them, attacking them, and you had dozens of suffragists who were injured during this. The newspaper coverage of this was outrage, basically, across the country. And so this parade did actually help sort of reboot the movement, gave them a lot of positive press, and sort of brought them to the forefront of the public discussion again. So as I mentioned, NAWSA, the new leaders that were coming up to do that parade, and by the way, I wanted to show y'all what some of the labels look like so you can see the two ways to seek suffrage, conservative versus militant here. And we talk about how NAWSA, which was led in the from 1900 to about 1920 by two women, Carrie Chapman Catt on the left and Reverend Anna Howard Shaw on the right there, their approach was very much conservative, working in their social circles, using their prominent friends to work with the men in power, trying to go state by state. And they thought if they got enough states to vote for suffrage, then they would be able to use those states to pass a federal amendment. There were younger women in the movement like Alice Paul and Lucy Burns here down on the bottom who got tired of waiting to be given suffrage and wanted to actively fight for it more. And so they organized that parade in March of 1913. And by the fall of that year, they have broken away to form a new organization, originally called the Congressional Union, but eventually goes by the name of the National Woman's Party. And both Paul and Burns sort of cut their teeth working in the suffrage movement in England with the more militant suffragists or suffragettes there. And so they wanted to use some of those methods in America. Not all of them, they weren't as militant as them, but they did come up with new ideas and ways to get the movement much more in the forefront here. And so some of those methods are very famous now today. So if you look in the top left corner, we have women picketing the White House. You can see those tricolor banners are going to be purple, gold, and white, the colors of the National Woman's Party. You can see the banners that are calling out the president. They are the first group to do this. When we see people protesting in front of the White House today, this comes from the National Woman's Party, this idea of going there and standing. It was very unpopular with most of the country, but they were called the Silent Sentinels. They stood there. Every time that Wilson came in or out, he had to pass them. Anybody going by the White House saw them. Every morning they would leave the National Woman's Party headquarters, which was just sort of across the park from the White House, and march over. They would stand out in all kinds of weather. And they very slowly sort of made that impact by their pertinacity and just being there over and over. They also continued that when World War I started, which made them pretty unpopular with a lot of the population. You had certain events where soldiers or sailors would attack the women. You had the women actually calling out Wilson. You can see here in the center, Virginia Arnold was actually one of the few North Carolina women who worked for the National Woman's Party with her Kaiser Wilson banner, not a popular banner. She was arrested. She was jailed multiple times. They did start arresting these members of the National Woman's Party. Initially, it was like sort of trumped up charges about blocking the sidewalk, but they were sending these women to jail. And once they got there, the women were very incensed that they were not treated as political prisoners. They were treated as regular criminals. And so they began starting hunger strikes. They were force fed during those. So when you think of the picketing and the marching and the forced feedings, the hunger strikes, that's all the National Woman's Party. And they did eventually gain more public sympathy once it began leaking out about how they were being treated once they were arrested. Down in the bottom left, there's also another tactic that they used, which was they called it the watchfires of freedom. In 1919, they started burning copies of President Wilson's speeches where he was demanding democracy abroad, and they were pointing out the hypocrisy of, half of Americans not being able to vote, meaning women, not pointing out the hypocrisy of the fact that they were not actually trying to get African-American women the right to vote. So these are all some of those militant methods, and it's important to remember that for North Carolina, the groups here disassociated themselves with the National Woman's Party. You have a few members in North Carolina, but for the most part, NAWSA is the prime force here, and they really are trying to work with men to get the vote, and they are constantly disavowing the concept of this militant suffragism. So that brings us to area 2, the part about North Carolina, for the long haul, the fight for suffrage here. This image is one of few, and when I say few, I mean less than 5 images we have of North Carolina suffragists in action. On the left is Gertrude Wheel, who is probably the most well-known suffragist in North Carolina, and this is an image that she gave to the state archives, which is why we still have it today. And one of the things we do with this image in the exhibit, which I really like, is we do this in several labels where we take images and documents that are primary sources and sort of point out and ask questions so that visitors can see, how historians use them to take a look at the past. So, we have this label saying this is probably the most widely used image of North Carolina suffragists. It's the only picture we have of women wearing sashes. And these sashes are not the same sashes that we have in our collection. So this is the only time that, you know, we have proof that they were used. We have no idea what's going on here, honestly. Once I started this exhibit and started researching into this, I was amazed that we just really don't know why this photo was taken, where it was taken. We know that Gertrude Wheel is there on the left, and she identified 2 other women. The woman who is to the right of the sign in the center, and then the woman on the far right were sisters who lived in Goldsboro with Gertrude. So was this picture taken in Goldsboro? We know 3 of the women are from Goldsboro, but we don't know for sure. We don't know who the other women are. We don't know why they did this. I can't find any newspaper reports of any kind of parade. There was very little parading in North Carolina. I can't find reports of any event that would describe something where this picture would have been taken. There are no reports of anything called a battalion of male sympathizers, which is the sign that the man's holding. We don't know who that man is. So we use this picture to kind of point out that much of what happened here has sort of been forgotten over time. We, you know, I'm sure this group can actually name a few suffragists that were active in North Carolina, but when I talk to most people, they may have heard of Gertrude Wheel, but beyond that, just most of the women who were involved in this fight have sort of been forgotten over time. And so we use this symbol to kind of bring that point out to people. Something else that we of course have to talk about with the fight for suffrage in North Carolina, why did it look different here? Well, in the South, you cannot talk about the struggle for women's suffrage without talking about racism, states' rights, white supremacy. The South was very slow to support suffrage because most Southerners, most white Southerners were afraid that opening the discussion of who could vote would reopen something that they had sort of quietly settled on their own, the creation of all the Jim Crow voter suppression tactics that had emerged after around 1900 that the federal government wasn't doing anything about. They did not want to reopen the discussion of who could vote because they were afraid that would reopen the discussion of why they were practicing voter suppression. You did get some people who supported a slow move towards state-by-state suffrage, but they did not want the federal government involved and did not want that federal amendment for the most part, the majority of people. Okay, so the story here in North Carolina, as I mentioned earlier, very little suffrage interest here early on. It is the 1890s before you can find any women in North Carolina who are actively taking part in suffrage action. And you can see down on the left here, Helen Morris Lewis. She was actually from South Carolina, but was living in Asheville at the time. And she and her friend Floride Cunningham, who was also from South Carolina, came together in 1894 and had what we think is the very first public meeting for women's suffrage that was calling for forming a group or a statewide group for support of women's suffrage. And so you can see the flyer that was for it, which I think is just so cool that that still exists. They had this meeting in the courthouse in Asheville, which there's an image there of it. The mayor of Asheville was actually in support of this group. The newspapers are sort of grudgingly surprised at how big the turnout was and the interest. And a week after they have this initial meeting, they get together at the mayor's house and form the North Carolina Equal Rights Association. And Helen Morris Lewis is elected as its first president. She campaigns some in the area, visits a few towns, tries to drum up support for suffrage. This group holds on for a couple of years. It never really goes statewide. It's centered in Asheville in the mountains, but it does sort of peter out by 1900. We do know that Lila Barnwell, who we saw earlier, she lived in Hendersonville, and we know she was active in the national movement. She attended, beginning in 1896, she attended some of the national NAWSA conferences. In 1921, she actually ran for city commissioner in Hendersonville, but was defeated. And actually, Helen Morris Lewis is the first woman that we know of who ran for office in North Carolina. She ran for the head of the department of, or head of the water board in Asheville in 1899 and lost that as well. The other woman that we know of who was active here during this period was Anna Julia Cooper, and she was an African-American woman born in slavery in Raleigh, who eventually goes on to be the 4th African-American woman to earn a PhD. She moves to Washington, D.C. In 1892, she writes a book called A Voice from the South by a woman of the South. or by a Black woman of the South. And she, in that book, calls for African American women to have suffrage separate, or in addition to African American men already having it, because she says that women need that suffrage for other reasons. They need to be able to protect themselves. And she is, writing about suffrage, but she is not living in North Carolina at the time. But she is one of only 2 African Americans that we know for sure were fighting for suffrage in North Carolina. I don't believe that they were the only people who supported it here, but they're just the only 2 that we can still find in written records for sure. We have a section that's called Organizing to Fight that we have some artifacts in that you can see the case here. The big question is, if you have gone from having no support for suffrage to trying to form leagues and bring about suffrage, where does that disconnect get covered? Like, how do women go from having no political experience to being able to organize? And one of the big answers to that, particularly in North Carolina, is the women's club movement. So around 1900, it sort of becomes socially acceptable for women to join book clubs, singing clubs, civic clubs. And in 1902, this woman on the top left, Sally Southall Cotton, forms or gets the idea to form the North Carolina's Federation of Women's Clubs. And so she brings these groups all together under one group, and they become a relatively powerful group in North Carolina for being made up of non-voters. And the movement at first does not necessarily support suffrage. They're very conscious that some of their members don't support it. Eventually, though, by 1918, they come out and pass a statement in favor of suffrage. And by that time, only 2 of their members actively oppose it. They were formed in 1902. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who you can see beside Sally, formed the North Carolina Federation of Negro Women's Clubs in 1909. Charlotte Hawkins Brown is the other African-American woman who we know was actively fighting for suffrage. Most of her suffrage support actually comes after 1920 because she is working to try and get African-American women the right to vote, because most of them are being denied that after the amendment passes. She did believe, though, in the motto that they chose for the Federation of Negro Women's Clubs, which was "Lifting as we climb," that the vote would help lift up the African-American race if women and men had the vote. So in this case, you can see the gray dress was worn by Sally Southall Cotton. The banner is from another club group that was formed to support business and professional women in the state. I did want to put this picture in here just to show you the video. You can sort of an awkward screen pause of the actor that we have there, but we do have screens. One of them is out of sight in this image, but they're facing against each other, where we have recorded actors delivering lines from both pro and anti, or Suff and anti voices from the time period from the 1890s to the 1920s. We went through and excerpted stuff from flyers, from speeches, from newspaper reports, and then we have actors delivering those lines. You can see these videos if you go to our website, ncmuseumofhistory.org. We have an area called History at Home, and in it you can find actually a tour of me going through the exhibit that we did as part of a live broadcast to students across the state. And then you can find these videos that you can watch and see all of the actors bringing those lines to life, which is pretty cool. Okay, so now that we're talking about North Carolina, it is important to note that we were the last state to form a state league for working for suffrage. So the North Carolina Equal Suffrage League, which you will also see referred to sometimes as the North Carolina Equal Suffrage Association, was formed in 1913. There's no evidence of any local clubs really before 1913. The first club that we know of was in Morganton, and it was some women who marched in a 4th of July parade with Votes for Women signs. And then the newspapers report that a few weeks after that, they formed a local club. We also know a woman formed a club in Bakersville in the mountains shortly after that. By October of that year, 1913, you have a group of 7 women who are either from Charlotte or connected to people in Charlotte come together to form the first state league. You have Anna Forbes Liddell, Susan Bynum that you can see here were 2 of the leaders for that. They get together and do the float that you can see, and this is the only picture of a suffrage float known from North Carolina. The parading it was very popular up north. Down here, it was just not done as much. This is not a suffrage parade. This is actually the Mecklenburg Declaration parade that Charlotte used to have every year. So this is a parade in May, and they just happened to have this float during that parade. The woman down at the bottom, Lavinia Ingle, is not North Carolinian, but she was an organizer that NAWSA sent here. And she traveled to at least 20 different towns in the state, and almost all of those towns then formed individual suffrage leagues after her visit. So this idea sort of really takes off in 1913. You have the state league, which starts with about 40 men and women, and then you have all these local leagues being formed too. Two of the really cool artifacts that we have in the exhibit here. I love this Votes for Women stationery that's on the left with a little yellow outline. This is a letter that Jessie Bicknell sent to Mary Palmer, who was one of those 7 original members and who was acting as treasurer for the State League in 1914. And this letter is basically Jessie Bicknell, who lived up in Linville Falls, saying that she's sending dues for her husband to join the League. And she is talking about how she does a local column in the newspaper for suffrage. Her sister is the president of their local league. And so she's just sort of talking about that movement in her town, her area. The picture is of her within her Duck Lancelot. And then off to the right, we have a program from the first annual meeting of that Equal Suffrage League, 1914. And the president at the time is the woman that's pictured below, Barbara Henderson. She was one of those original founders, and she was the sister of Suzanne Bynum that we saw on the previous page. Her husband, Archibald Henderson, was a professor at UNC Chapel Hill. He was a very vocal male supporter of the movement. The two of them traveled across the state and gave speeches. It is important to note, though, that she was very much coming at this from a conservative approach. This is the image she used all the time. You can see that she's a beautiful young mother in it. It's very reassuring that she's asking for suffrage, not being strident in any way. She came out and openly said that the group that they had formed, the State League, was going to be associated with NAWSA. They were not associated with the National Woman's Party. They were not associated with militancy. The idea was very much that they were asking for suffrage as a chivalrous act from their male counterparts. They wanted those men to give them suffrage. They weren't trying to force and take it. We have a case here with some of the objects from some of our Suffs. So this area is sort of a Suff versus anti area. The dress that's in the back is from Lillian Exum Clement, that first legislator that we mentioned, who is an active suffragist up around Asheville area. Gertrude Wheel, who I've also mentioned, who was president of the organization and the state organization in 1919 and 1920. So it was very, very important while the struggle was going on for ratification here. We have some of her original artifacts from the Goldsboro League. Lita Rodman, who was an early treasurer. We have like the notebook that she used for the State League. And then Chief Justice Walter Clark, who was probably the most vocal male supporter, also used lots of racist and white supremacist language in his justification for suffrage, but would go anywhere they asked him and give speeches. And we have a copy of one of his speeches. He was very active in helping the women try and get the right to vote. Not all Tar Heel suffragists were living in North Carolina. There was a group of around a dozen or so expats up in DC who were active fighting there, mainly with the National Woman's Party. Ella Clapp Thompson was the woman that founded that Bakersville League, one of the early leagues, and then moved to the DC area. She was a national She works to organize nationally. I'm trying to go fast here, so I don't go over. For the National Woman's Party. Minnie Brooke, who was from the Outer Banks and had attended Trinity, which is now Duke, before she moved up to DC, was also prominent in the National Woman's Party. She was a regularly scheduled street speaker who would stand on street corners and talk to people about the suffrage movement. They both attended the march that you can see the image of, suffragists marching to the Capitol in 1913. You can see the heavy police presence for this one a year after the disastrous response to the parade. This was about 500 suffragists who marched to the Capitol to deliver a petition for a national amendment. And then Josephine Arnold that we see here, Virginia Arnold, was the woman that we saw holding the Kaiser Wilhelm banner earlier. She was actually step-niece to Justice Clark that we saw on the previous page. And she traveled all across the country organizing for the National Woman's Party as well, was arrested, was part of all the picketing at the White House. Another place that suffrage found support in North Carolina was on college campuses. This is a time when more and more women are receiving a college education. Two that really stand out are Meredith and the State Normal College, which is now UNCG. And so you can see on the right that the only yearbook photo of a college league that we know of is here at Meredith in 1918. You can see them coming down the steps, and that Patriots Not Picket banner that, I don't know if you can see it, but up on the steps indicates, of course, that they are associated with NAWSA, and they're sort of against that picketing concept that the National Women's Party is doing. Both members from Meredith and from what is now UNCG, about 750 women signed a petition in 1918 to give in support of suffrage that was given to both of North Carolina senators. The image on the top left, on the back row, the woman second from the right is Harriet Elliott. She was a professor that came to UNCG from Illinois. She did maintain her voting address in Illinois so that she could vote in presidential elections. She was a professor of politics, and she very much encouraged a lot of the students to become active in politics and in fighting for suffrage. And then after women get the right to vote, she was also very active in running citizenship schools and in the League of Women Voters as well. So this area I mentioned sort of off to the right of this picture is where we just looked at suffrage artifacts. And then to the left, we have some of our anti artifacts. And we have this sort of antis versus suff wall where we get into just some general information about those groups. So suffs tended to be young, well-educated. They tended to have college degrees, tended to come from families that were from sort of the growing professional class at the time. And that group of, doctors, lawyers, professors, retailers, newspaper editors, those were all, not all, but a lot of those people were sort of in favor of suffrage. And these women were more likely to have maybe held a job outside the home, especially when they were younger, maybe as a secretary or a stenographer. And they were more likely to have experienced somewhere through travel by either going to college outside of the state. A lot of the state's leaders in the movement actually were educated outside of North Carolina. So they were more likely to have had some sort of contact with an area that supported suffrage more than North Carolina did. And we use this as one of those areas I mentioned to do a lot of kind of call outs with these primary sources. And the one I blew up for y'all to be able to see is some of the letterhead from the North Carolina Equal Suffrage Association. I love this. They list 96 advisory board members. These were all prominent men in support of suffrage. They really wanted to get that point across that there were prominent men that supported them. 3 future governors on the list. And a lot of those men that are listed are from those professions that were in that sort of growing middle class that supported the movement. Aunties, these women were less likely to have been educated out of state, less likely to have gotten a full college degree. They were less likely to have held any kind of job outside the home, much more likely to come from a family that was either associated with textile mills or large landholding families or the railroad. All 3 of those were sort of economic supporters of anti-suffragism. And they were much more likely to fear suffrage as a social ill. They were afraid that it would change society, whether that meant sort of messing with women's place in society, or in many cases, it also meant they were afraid that it would be detrimental to white supremacy. One of the ones I pulled out here is this flyer that was sent out by an anti-suffrage group that is Household Hints. And I blew this up so you can see a few of them. You do not need a ballot to clean out your sink spout. A handful of potash and some boiling water is quicker and cheaper. To drive out mice, scatter small pieces of camphor in cupboards and drawers. Peddlers and suffs are harder to scare. And then the one that I think is particularly important is at the bottom of the spot removers. After they give you ways you can remove spots, there is, however, no method known by which mud-stained reputations may be cleansed after bitter political campaigns. And this brings out one of the issues that went back and forth a lot. Suffs maintained that they would be able to clean up politics. Women would be able to clean up all the corruption. If you brought women into voting and politics, they would make everything better. They would support women, they would support children with laws, and they would clean up politics. Aunties tended to say that just the involvement in politics would dirty women, it would make them lesser. And so that is sort of a running theme that you see. And it also answers a little bit that question of why textile mill owners. Here we'll see, we have letterhead from the Men's States' Right League, the Men's Anti-League in North Carolina. And you can see worked in the textile industry, owned textile mills, owned several mills. The reason that textile mill owners were strongly anti-suffrage was that they were afraid that if women voted, they would likely pass more or be able to support more laws aimed at ending child labor and ending like long hours for women and mothers as well. And so that's one of the reasons we call out that particular letter. If you look over on this side to the right, you can see that there is a letterhead from the women's anti-organization that was in North Carolina. And here, you know, husband owned a textile mill, husband was bishop of the Episcopal Diocese, husband owned large land holdings, husband orchestrated the 1898 Wilmington coup. Very strong connections with white supremacy here. I've put these two in here to remind me that in this area, we do show visitors or ask visitors, why would women want to be antis? I think that's very hard for modern women, especially young women, to understand. Like, why would women be actively campaigning against getting the right to vote for themselves? And, you know, one of the reason was that many of these were middle and upper class white women who were afraid of the social changes, afraid of losing white supremacy. And a lot of these women had financial connection. Their family support came from businesses and industries that they felt would be harmed by passage of women's suffrage. And we also have another one, because you have antis saying they don't want the right to vote, and you have Suffs saying they do want the right to vote. So which was it? And this is in there just to point out that, you know, the antis claim that only a handful of active agitating white women wanted the right to vote. Those women who were fighting for the right to vote claimed that many more women wanted the right to vote. We really don't know what the numbers were in North Carolina. Of course, there was no kind of polling at the time. We don't have sources that tell us what working women felt about this, what African-American women felt about this, what women of color in general. We just don't know in any kind of written sources what they felt about it. And I think that's important to remind people that what you're looking at here is a fight between wealthy white women and men for the most part. Okay, so our anti-case here, we have two people that we call out there. Minnie Tucker Baker was from Raleigh. She was the secretary of the women's anti-group. Also important to note that antis didn't need to flex their muscles in this fight. It was many years of Suffs fighting for the right to vote without a whole lot of pushback, because they knew that they had their people in charge. It wasn't until they felt really threatened in the summer of 1920 when the amendment has passed Congress and it's gone out to the states, and it becomes evident that there is going to be a fight in North Carolina over ratification, and North Carolina may be important in that national fight, that these anti-forces come out in force. And you have a women's anti-league and a men's anti-league formed, and they open offices in Raleigh. They start creating a newspaper to send out. They're sending out flyers and brochures to people. And so Minnie Baker was secretary of that women's organization. And you will be shocked to hear that her husband owned several textile mills. Her father was one of the state's largest landowners. William Holt Williamson, who happened to be Minnie's brother-in-law, was also a textile mill owner. The book that you can see in the case is the time book from Pilot Mills here in Raleigh that he owned. And he was president of the men's organization. So, you know, we also have a label in this case that, again, hammers home that concept of there's no escape from the connection with white supremacy here. All of the anti-literature is very openly white supremacist. Okay, so we have this big fight in 1920. It comes down to North Carolina and Tennessee being the final two states. Either one could have been the 36th and final necessary state for ratification. The Suffs actually thought they had a decent chance. They weren't sure, but it turns out that they were to be disappointed by their home state. The telegram that you can see is a round robin telegram that 63 of the members of the House, North Carolina House, sent to Tennessee, telling them, hey, we don't want to support this. We don't want you to force it on us. You don't vote for it, we won't vote for it. It came down to a vote in the Senate, where at the last minute, a particular senator, Warren, came out and changed it to a vote on, amended it so that it was a vote on delaying, and they voted 25 to 23 to delay discussion for another year, which they knew was passing the buck. They knew it would be settled by them. And then Tennessee does manage to ratify it. The House doesn't vote until a day after Tennessee has ratified it, so they know it's passed. They still vote 71 to 41 against the amendment. So this label, we show some of the women who had been leaders in the movement and their reactions to what it felt like for their state. Nell Battle Lewis there on the left said it was like being slapped in the face by your state. But they all were also very positive in the end, going, but hey, we got the vote anyway. So right after that, we talk about the League of Women Voters, which I'm sure y'all will be interested in. We talk about how almost immediately in the state, it switches from being the North Carolina Equal Suffrage Association. By October of that year, Gertrude Wheel, and then you can see down on the bottom right, Louise Vann, are both sending out notices in the newspaper saying that we're switching over to becoming a group within the League of Women Voters. The national group was, of course, formed in 1919 before I think it was 1919 or early 1920, before Cherry Catman Cat does it, even before the amendment has passed. And so North Carolina forms its group. You can see also the picture there of Elsie Riddick, who was the founder of the Wake County League here. She had been an active suffragist in Raleigh before that. This sort of is the answer to the question, okay, you have the vote now, what are you going to do? You've got all kinds of women who either did not want it, because there were plenty of women in North Carolina of all social and political bents who were not in favor of it, and yet now they have the vote. So the League of Women Voters becomes an organization that provides a lot of that early education. We have a case with some things that is right below this label, showing some of the numerous booklets and pamphlets that they produce. And a lot of these are just all about, how do you go about being a good citizen? What does it mean to vote? There were citizenship schools across the country. And this is another one of those that the picture is not quite finished. The two things that are missing in here are on either side of that school for citizenship. There's an image of Harriet Elliott, the teacher that I mentioned at UNCG, because she ran that school that the pamphlet is there for. And then the other is an image of the interior of that pamphlet, just showing some of the courses that are literally things like, how does a local government run? You know, it is information for voters trying to make women the best voters that they can be. Again, we are talking about white women here in the South. So the rest of the exhibit is the wait continues for many. You know, African-American women, women of color are going to continue to fight until 1965, before that Federal Voting Rights Act, before they truly have the right to vote. There was a lot of the suffragists during this fight were using, you know, openly racist things, saying that it's okay to support us white women for voting because we outnumber the African-American women. So even if they do get added, even if they can pass those literacy tests, we'll still outnumber them. Another thing that white suffragists would say is that it doesn't matter, just give us the vote and we'll suppress their vote the same way that we've suppressed the men's vote. And that is what happens, that those votes are suppressed until 1965. This area also covers the winning the vote but not equal rights, where we talk about the Equal Rights Amendment in North Carolina. It is written in 1923 by Alice Paul. It was not passed by the Congress until 1972. North Carolina debated its ratification 6 different times between 1973 and 1982 and did not pass it any of those times. Actually, in 1971, just to step back, we did not ratify the 19th Amendment until a symbolic vote in 1971, and we have never ratified the ERA. If you can see that little map on the label, the yellow states highlighted are the 12 states who have never ratified, and we are one of those states. To the right of that, we have our section called Still Fighting, where we talk about women still, you know, being politically active and taking part in political actions and protests. We have a poster from the first Women's March here in Raleigh, poster from the March for Our Lives, the pink hat that we call a protest hat. And then the final section is Still Waiting for Equal Representation. This is where we say, you know, women got the right to vote in 1920. Very few women, though, are running for office. You have a few women who become mayors of small towns. You have some of the women who are really big in the fight for suffrage who become delegates to either the state or national Democratic and Republican conventions. They get some power within the parties, but they're not running for office, or they're not successful. A few of them run, but they're not successful. And it isn't until 1996 that North Carolina has its first woman elected to statewide office, which is Elaine Marshall as our Secretary of State. It's 1992 before you have a woman elected to Congress, Eva Clayton, who was also the first African-American woman from North Carolina elected to Congress. So this section, we have a suit worn by Bev Perdue, who was obviously our first female governor, And we have some political things from women who were the first in their statewide offices, and all those first after Elaine Marshall are in the 2000s before they happened. The little yellow t-shirt on the back wall is from Isabella Cannon, who was elected mayor of Raleigh, and that was in 1977, but she was the first woman elected mayor of a large, really large city in North Carolina. So we've gone through the whole exhibit now. The exhibit sort of ends with this, we call it our mirror wall. It's they fought to vote, what will you fight for? And you can stand in front, see yourself reflected in the mirror along with all these men and women that either fought for the right to vote in the 1920s or continued that fight through the civil rights movement. There's a computer below it where you can touch and get information about all the people that are pictured there. And then we also have this photo op at the very end. This is an image of the North Carolina Equal Suffrage League offices during that fight in 1920 for ratification, and a group of the women who worked on the exhibit using that photo op when we opened. And we have our last little call out here. Why is our photo op about women sitting behind a desk and not women marching? Just to make that point again, that here in North Carolina, there weren't these huge parades. There weren't women picketing and standing with signs. The way that women won the vote here, or at least fought to try to win the vote here, was by sitting at a desk, writing the letters, making the connections, calling on the people that they knew in power, trying to get them to change their minds. That persuasion through writing and through physical contact. They would go and visit the legislators. They would send them letters. One thing I love about this photo, I'll just point out before I wrap up, is that one, you can see the dog sitting in the chair in it. The woman sitting at the right is Cornelia German, who was one of the big women from Raleigh working in the suffrage movement. That's her son Palmer, and I assume their dog. And he is wearing, the dog is wearing the Votes for Women banner. There's one on the wall or sash above Palmer, and then there's one sort of stripped along the desk. One of these is probably the one we have in our collection, because that is Gertrude Wheel sitting on the left there, and she's the one that gave it years ago to the Museum of History. I find it really interesting that there are no pictures of women wearing these sashes, but we do have this picture of them in use this way. Okay, I'm gonna breathe now and see about taking some questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Raylana. That looks like a beautiful exhibit. The first question I have is the North Carolina History Museum open at this point, or?
We are not yet open. We will wait to be, we'll see what the governor says in the next go round, but currently we are closed to the public. Yes, all the state museums are.
And how long is this exhibit expected to be installed at the museum?
I think right now it is probably up through September. That may change depending on when we reopen. We definitely want it to stay open long enough for people to get a chance to come and see it. So okay, it will be there for a while.
That's kind of what I was getting at. Thank you. Another question we have, and this is concerning the picketing at the White House of President Wilson. Is it a myth that women chained themselves to the White House gates at that time?
That is an excellent question. I did not come across anything about being chained to the gates, but I don't know enough to say for sure whether they did or did not. They were sometimes stationed just standing there with their signs, and then they are sometimes sort of walking in circles in front of the gates. They would try and not resist too much when they were being, they would resist when they're being arrested. There are images of them sort of being dragged away, but sort of similar to what we see images from the civil rights movement of, being drug away, but they're not beating people with signs and stuff. They're trying to act as political prisoners, even as they're being arrested.
Right. Finally, what was the process? When you're putting an exhibit like this together, what does the sort of workflow look like?
We work in teams at the museum. So I was the curator on this. I worked with a designer, with a graphic designer, with an educator, with an editor, and with people in our collection section who are going to work with the artifacts. And so we all work together to sort of come up with the ideas. The curator, does a lot of that background research and comes up with the basic storyline. I will say that this one was unique for me because I didn't realize how little we knew about the women's suffrage movement in North Carolina until I had to produce an exhibit about it. I had seen these images all along my career. I knew some of the basic, I knew Gertrude, I knew some of those names, and I knew the basic national story. But it wasn't until I started looking into it that I really understood the depth of that connection with white supremacy and the depth of the difference in the South and the way that people weren't supporting it here, and how these women really initially were having to stand up against all the people who were, their equals in society and say, no, we want this, when those people probably were not in favor of it. That, some of these, especially early on, I think it was, a brave thing for them to do. So it was fascinating for me to do the research and find all these people and just, go back through. I read a lot of period newspapers, went for trying to find references for who these women were, trying to find out more about them, trying to find their images. I looked at a lot of period yearbooks because that was where the only place I could find a lot of their images, and just seeing those connections build. Oh, this one knew this other woman because they went to school together, or oh, this one is this one's cousin or sister, and you can see those connections in the way that they built and the way that they work to organize together through their social connections as well. Sorry, that's getting a little bit away from how we build the exhibits, but in general, we would take a year or so and do the research, start to come up with ideas of how we want to convey that. What artifacts do we have that will convey it? We borrowed a lot of artifacts for this exhibit from the state archives because we had some things from Gertrude, but and we had some of the clothing, but we borrowed a lot of the paper items. The letter that you saw, the pamphlets that you see, those are all borrowed from the archives for this one.
That kind of leads into the next question, which is, why was the suffrage movement in North Carolina most active in the western part of the state in the mountains?
I don't know that it necessarily was. Some of the people that I highlighted were from there, but I did find women in a lot of the other communities. I think it's fair to say it was stronger there, but it's not fair to say that there weren't. There was a group in Greenville. One of the National Women's Party women that I mentioned grew up on the coast, and she visited towns along there. I think much in the same way that a lot of North Carolina history is the East sort of having more wealth and power and opposing expansion of rights into the West, that is a little bit of a similar thing here. You tend to get a lot more anti-suffrage support in the East because that's where those large agricultural landholders are. But then some of the textile mills are going to be Piedmont, so that the anti-ism in the Piedmont is going to be based more in mills. And then the Suff support is, this is an interesting question because I've never really thought it through before, but I think, you get a lot of those early ones in the West because the West has always been a little bit more like that, always been fighting for its rights a little bit more, and the East has always been fighting to keep, the status quo a little bit more. That might be sort of that same history that comes through in North Carolina there.
Okay, I've got just a couple more questions. You mentioned that one argument for women's suffrage in North Carolina was that the votes of white women would outweigh the votes of African Americans. Did you find that directly attributed to Gertrude Wheel, or I guess who was that attributed to?
You can see it there. One of the things that was on that Suff wall was a paper that I'm pretty sure was put out by the Equal Suffrage League that, does that statement. Justice Clark was very open in saying those things when he was giving speeches, and you can see it in his printed speeches. You can see it actually in information from NAWSA as well. The state, the national level is distributing some of that stuff in the South as well. Gertrude would walk the line a little bit, but yeah, she did actually use those statements sometimes.
And finally, and I think many of us would agree with this, one of our members says, great exhibit, and thank you to your team and to you as curator. I learned a great deal. I am so grateful for the careful work of the museum, and the reconstruction and World War I exhibits were stellar too, and I would second that. So with that, I want to thank you. And to our attendees, Diana has a few announcements that she would like to make. So if you could stay on for a couple minutes, that would be great.
Yeah, just
And
a
thank you
moment.
again, Ray.
Yes, thank you, Raylana. We've had a team working for about 2 years looking into our own history, which of course is directly tied to the suffrage movement here, such as it was, and yet I learned so much more just from your talk today. I want to remind those of you who are attending the webinar that we still have several events coming up that are related to either the 100th anniversary of the League of Women Voters or the centennial of the 19th Amendment, including our commemoration of Women's Equality Day that is going to be August 25th. Women's Equality Day is actually the 26th, but we're doing our event on the 25th. Raylana mentioned the activity at Meredith College. We are co-sponsoring what was going to be a live performance called The Activists at Meredith College in their theater department. They're instead going to present that online and watch for updates, and I'll be able to give you a link to that. Speaking of theater and telling this story, we've partnered with the Burning Coal Theater here in Raleigh on something called the 19th Amendment Project. It's 14 original one-act plays, and I hope that you'll support Burning Coal Theater and buy a $25 ticket gets you the entire series, or you can purchase them individually for $2. And we're going to do a watch party in September. So if you purchase a ticket, you'll also be able to participate in the watch party. We have a book discussion coming up in a couple months focused on the book Gender and Jim Crow. And finally, we were going to do a couple tours, one a suffrage-themed tour of downtown Raleigh. The other was going to be a suffrage and league-themed tour of Oakwood Cemetery. We're working now on converting those into self-guided tours, so something that you can do while we're all sort of isolating and avoiding large events. I hope that you'll participate in some of these upcoming events. And again, I want to thank Raylana and thank all of you for signing on and participating.